DC 20013. We've now extended the deadline for our essay contest until January 15th.
Washington Journal continues.
Joining us at the table is Robert Spencer, a columnist for frontpagemag.com. Good morning.
Good morning.
Well, we can take a look at one of your latest articles here, and you talk about the conspiratorial mind of the Arab world. You say some of the stories out there include the fact that Saddam Hussein is actually in Tel Aviv, that he's been an agent for the U.S. and Israel since 1980. His capture was an elaborate charade designed to bolster the flagging morale of American troops in Iraq. You also say Saddam's sons, Uday and Qusay, are in Monte Carlo, continuing to live the high life. Where, Robert Spencer, does this stuff come from?
It comes from everywhere. Really, it's a very important and very often overlooked element of the political discourse in the Middle East. Politicians, journalists, people at the highest levels engage in this wild kind of conspiracy theory thinking that to American minds seems absurd, but it has a tremendous influence on how the actions of the United States and how all the political events in the world are perceived over there.
Well, dig in a little bit more and tell us, again, why this happens. How does it start, and what's the purpose?
Well, I think mainly you're dealing with societies that are not free, where the governments often conspire and do things backhandedly and underhandedly, routinely. And so the people in those countries, including people in positions of power, are used to thinking of what they see on a screen as staged and orchestrated by political elements. And so when they see the United States do something like capture Saddam Hussein, or even when they see the planes flying into the World Trade Centers, they say, all right, who is this benefiting, and why are they staging it? And it's just assumed that the whole thing is not real. This is the atmosphere that is very common in this part of the world for a variety of reasons also that go back very centuries, really, in terms of how the Muslim world has viewed the non-Muslim world, with elements that are even rooted in the Quran, based on ideas that the non-Muslims will be conspiring against the Muslims, so that pious Muslims who take the Quran seriously and see it as a way to understand the world in all centuries, not just in the 7th century when it was first written or revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, as you may prefer. In any case, it says that the Jews and Christians in particular will be conspiring, will be working underhandedly against the Muslims. And this is how many Muslims see the world today. When they see the trade centers go down, when they see Saddam being captured, they say, well, this is the work of Mossad, this is the work of the CIA. They're trying to further their political aims in the Middle East.
Robert Spencer will be with us for about 40 minutes to talk about U.S.-Arab relations. He's a columnist for frontpagemag.com, also is director of an organization or an operation known as Jihad Watch. Yes. What is that?
Jihad Watch tracks jihadist movements around the world and in the United States, trying to call attention to the activities of the global jihad movement to underline to people exactly what kind of a conflict we're in and what we're facing in it and how we can deal with it most properly. And so every day there are news updates and other activities related to that there at the site jihadwatch.org.
Our guest is also author of this book, Onward, Muslim Soldiers, How Jihad Still Threatens America and the West. What do you say in this book?
The Onward, Muslim Soldiers is an exploration of jihad in general and shows how radical Muslim elements around the world and in the United States use traditional elements of Islam in order to recruit and motivate terrorists. And this is something that very few people have noted or remarked upon, that how is it exactly that these groups are able to get recruits? How are they able to keep growing? And it's because they exploit traditional notions of jihad in a way that not only gains them recruits, but co-opts moderate Muslims and makes them appear to be disloyal to the Islamic faith, such that they have no response to the radicals. And this is something we have to face forthrightly, because it makes for a situation where moderate Islam is in retreat around the world, because they're losing the theological battle, which is all important in this case. But for example, you take the case of the Al-Qaeda cell in Lackawanna, New York. These were secular Muslims who had fitted into American society until the Al-Qaeda recruiter showed up, and he told them, look, you're being disloyal to the Quran, you have to do these things or you're going to go to hell, you have to wage jihad. And he ended up getting 6 of them to go to Afghanistan, try to join up with Osama bin Laden.
Back, before we go to calls, Robert Spencer, back to the issue of these conspiracy theories you mentioned at the outset, that
Yes.
these are spread perhaps by the highest levels
Yes,
in that part
absolutely.
of the world. Give us some more detail.
I'll give you an example from not so recent history. The Shah of Iran, when he was in danger of being overthrown, he met with Jimmy Carter in Washington. And down the way, there were some anti-Shah protesters who were dispersed with tear gas. The tear gas happened to be downwind of the White House reception, and Jimmy Carter and the Shah ended up wiping their eyes and showing that they had fallen prey to the tear gas themselves by accident. Now, the picture of them wiping their eyes was widely disseminated around the world. And what you saw, what Khomeini and the Iranian opposition interpreted it as, is the Carter administration has abandoned the Shah, because they've staged this protest down the street to embarrass him and show him tearing up. And this obviously shows that they no longer support him, and they stepped up protests and demonstrations in Iran, which ultimately led to the Shah's toppling. Now, of course, we would see it was an accident, it had no significance whatsoever, but to this kind of conspiratorial mindset, which is so common in the Muslim world, nothing is an accident. Everything that happens has a purpose, and it has to be discerned in light of whatever it may be connected to.
Let's go to Arlington, Virginia. Our first call for Robert Spencer, U.S.-Arab Relations. Good morning.
Hi. You know, I know you're going to cut me off, but I have to say, ha, ha, ha. The Jewish conspiracy is dead. We're on to you guys. You can laugh all you want. You've been trying to do this for a lot of years. And ha, 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 because when you tried to set up to kill Saddam back in '92, your Jewish friends who were trying to kill him all got killed. When you tried to send a Jew up in space, the airship fell over Palestine, Texas. Don't you know God is working against you? Why don't you stop trying to demonize the Muslim world?
Robert Spencer.
Well, I think that your call is kind of an example of what I'm saying, that the paranoia about some kind of an international Jewish conspiracy is part of this. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the notorious forgery that claims that the Jews are plotting to rule the world, which has been demonstrated again and again to have been a forgery created by the Russian secret police in the time of the Tsar. It circulates widely in the Islamic world. As a matter of fact, it was just serialized on Egyptian television a couple of years ago, and a very similar presentation that makes a lot of the same points was serialized just this past Ramadan in Syria. And so you have this kind of idea that the Jews are secretly plotting to subvert the Muslim world. This is something that is fed actively by elements within the Islamic world, and it creates this kind of a paranoid reaction.
St. Charles, Illinois. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Spencer, and thank you for Jihad Watch.
Thank you.
It's refreshing to be able to view what's really happening in the Muslim world. The American media, and especially like the BBC, the Bias Broadcasting Corporation, and Peter Jennings and his friends at the Arabic Broadcasting Corporation, seem to whitewash violence that Arabs perpetrate against Christians and Jews all the time. They don't report the violence against Israelis or Americans. They just completely sweep it under the rug or try to justify it somehow. So I'm glad.
I think there's a lot of truth in what you're saying. Certainly there are incidents that are reported, but there are quite a few that have been ignored. For example, there was recently a group in Iraq. Iraqi Christians are under increasing pressure since Saddam has been overthrown, because Saddam ran what was in general a secular state, and although Christians were not given full equality of rights in Saddam's Iraq, nonetheless they had it a lot better off than they would under a strict Islamic state. Now that there are elements that are trying to establish a strict Islamic state in Iraq, you have incidents such as recently a group of Iraqi Christian churches received messages saying that the women had to be wearing the hijab, and they were even to convert to Islam or they were going to be subject to violence. Now, this was widely unreported and widely ignored. It's not the only incident of its kind either. There have been particularly targets of liquor stores in Iraq, which have been generally run by Christians because of the Islamic prohibition of alcohol. the classic Islamic law, the Sharia, forbids Christians actually to display alcohol, which means, in other words, to have it out in public, or particularly to sell it in a situation where Muslims might be in a position to buy it. But this has not been enforced in Iraq, although recently stores have been torched and the proprietors brutalized. But this kind of thing is not being reported, and I have the same puzzlement as you do. I don't know why that is, but I appreciate the opportunity to be able to call some attention to these things.
Talk to us more, Robert Spencer, about Jihad Watch. You can read it at jihadwatch.org. And as we take a look at that site, where'd the idea for this come from, and how do you put this together?
Well, a part of it came from what the lady was saying, that there's simply not complete coverage of a lot of these issues in the American press. So one of the primary things that we do is we focus on the foreign press. We pick up a lot of news from all kinds of sources, including Al Jazeera and other sources in the Islamic world, considering always, of course, the source that they come from. But we try to, in Jihad Watch, give a place where people can find all the activities from day to day that the global jihadist network is perpetrating, as well as their activities in the United States, not only to spread the radical jihad ideology among American Muslims, but also to cover their own tracks and to whitewash what they're doing, which is often aided and abetted by the mainstream press, I think not out of any sinister motive, but more out of an exaggerated desire not to offend multiculturalist sensibilities. And I've run afoul of that myself, but of course it's very important, I think, that we have to distinguish between bigotry, true bigotry, which is simply hatred of people because of who they are, and something like what I'm trying to do, which is simply to call attention to the activities of these people whose intentions have been quite clear, and that is to destroy the United States and the Western world. To try to characterize that as bigotry, I think, is really only a tactic of these people themselves to try to silence opposition voices.
And how is Jihad Watch funded?
Jihad Watch is, at this point, in search of funding. And we would like to actually attract some significant donors. And so if anybody there is interested, please contact me at the site, because what we're trying to do is make it into a larger organization as funding permits. For example, the Council on American Islamic Relations, which is widely accepted as a neutral civil rights organization in the United States, but actually there are a number of questions about it. The founder, Nihad Awad, has gone on record several times as saying he's in support of Hamas, which is registered as a terrorist organization by the State Department. And there were 3 people who were CARE operatives who were arrested for terrorist activities in the last year. So there are a number of questions about the Council on American Islamic Relations that would call into question its neutrality. In any case, what we want to do is make Jihad Watch a counterweight to that. In the media, in academia, for example, CARE is funding an initiative with Saudi money, as a matter of fact, to put books about Islam into the libraries, but the books that they're putting in are quite distorted and one-sided. So we would like to, if we could attract enough funding, then put in offer our own set of books to libraries that would give a more balanced picture.
Let's get back to those calls for Robert Spencer. Bayhead, New Jersey, thanks for waiting.
Good morning. I was wondering if your speaker there would perhaps like to enlighten the audience about the Crusades that started in 1096 and what the motives were behind that, and how perhaps the Arab world feels they're known for having a long historical memory.
Yes. Yes, the Crusades are very much an issue in the Muslim world today. That's absolutely true. And it's very important that we be aware of the real parameters of what the Crusades were and what they were in response to. As a matter of fact, Islamic armies under the banner of jihad in the 7th century, over 350 years before any crusade was ever, 450 years before there was ever any crusade, began to invade and conquer areas of the world, Egypt, North Africa, the Middle East, and so on, parts of Eastern Europe, as well as Spain and Western Europe. Islamic Jihad armies began to overrun these areas that had been Christian lands in the name of jihad. And the Crusades were called as a defensive action, as I say, several hundred years later. This is not to excuse the excesses of the Crusades or to say that everything they did was right. Far from it. But a lot of people characterize the tensions between the Western world and the Islamic world as beginning with the Crusades, as if the West had provoked the struggle, when in fact jihads had been waged against the Christian world for 450 years before 1095, when the First Crusade was called by Pope Urban. So there is a history of conflict, no doubt, but it began much earlier, and it began from the people who were acting in response to jihad, in accord with jihad ideology.
San Bernardino, California, good morning.
Hi.
Hi.
I wanted to call and thank you for having Robert Spencer online. He's one of the first people that sounds intelligent and eloquent and is spreading truth. I have a son who's you're welcome. I have a son who's in the military, and I'm a teacher as well, and I'm trying to raise my other young children. And I totally have never heard anybody speak about this. They keep blaming politics, and you're the first person that's actually talking truth.
Thank
and
you.
I hope you get a lot of support for your group, because there's this mantra of hate going around in the world, and it has nothing to do with politics. And if people would have their freedom and have education, then this world would have more respect, and that when the truth comes out, people are able to understand what you're saying. And I hear a lot of people calling, and they sound like they're not educated. And it's just beautiful to hear someone who's educated. Like I said, I watch 24/7 all the news stations, and they're so one-sided.
Yes.
And I just thank you, and I hope that you can go on more shows and spread your word.
Thanks. Let's go to Athens, Georgia. Good morning.
Hi. Yes, I believe that there is reasons that people come up with the so-called conspiracy theories.
Yes, there are.
Not that they draw wrong conclusions a lot, but I'm in the United States of America, and certain things like the toppling of Saddam's statue appear staged to me. I mean, so if you're the whole Jessica Lynch story seemed to be just a story about media manipulation, and in fact the Army, was involved in it. So, I may draw some wrong conclusions about what the truth is, but it leads you to not believe anything that you see, and I'm not even in an Arab country.
Thanks. Some examples by that viewer of things going on right here.
Yeah, well, this is not to say that there isn't any media manipulation. I think that we have to be aware that it's going on both sides, and there's some quite explosive things that I think are going to come out pretty soon about that. But in any case, to say that there is media manipulation is not to say that there aren't conspiracy theories or paranoia going around. The importance of the conspiracy theories, though, we have to remember, is not simply just to that they're kind of amusing and fun to read about and silly to imagine, that Uday and Qusay are in Monte Carlo playing pool or something. But the fact is that they influence how the Islamic world views the United States and American policy. In particular, the idea that the towers were taken down by Mossad or the CIA or both is widespread in the Islamic world, and it leads to this incredible suspicion about the American intentions there. And that's not to say that no suspicion about American intentions there is justified, but simply that it is based on these false and rather fantastic premises makes for a climate of suspicion that makes it all the more difficult to try to come to some kind of rational and mutual understanding.
What does this country and perhaps other countries do about dealing with these kinds of thoughts, these kinds of theories? How do they push through and get through that stuff?
I would say that the response is not altogether adequate, because most of the time the State Department and American policymakers want to take the high road. And they say, well, we're simply not going to respond to these things, we're going to ignore these things because they're really beneath our mention. To have to deny that the CIA took down the World Trade Center is is ridiculous. But the fact is, though, that it might be better to take a frontal approach and simply to come out with some kind of a statement that, to the effect that these things did not happen, simply to provide some kind of a counterweight, because otherwise they just continue to spread and continue to spread, and the silence on the part of American officials only fuels their spreading.
Hollywood, California, for Robert Spencer. Hello to you.
Good morning.
Morning.
Yes, Mr. Spencer.
Yes.
I am a Muslim, and
Yes.
In the Quran, I have been taught that jihad is to be used by the individual within himself to get rid of his nafs, or what we call the evils that we have within our own lives.
Yes.
It's not to be used as an attack against any other human being.
Yes.
What I can't understand is why everybody takes the, let's say, the Khomeini's view or some of the Iraqis' view and spread it as to being that all Muslims are trying to attack the United States or do not
Yes.
like the United States. Myself, I'm a citizen of the United States, having been born here, and I love the United States, of course, having served in the military, etc., etc. What I can't understand is why you feel, it appears to me at any rate, that you feel that all of us
May I ask, sir, have you read my book, Onward Muslim Soldiers?
I beg your pardon?
Have you read my book, Onward Muslim Soldiers?
No, sir.
Okay. Well, I would invite you to read it, not simply out of self-serving motives, but because of the fact that you will find in it that nowhere do I say, in it or in any of my other books or in any of the articles that I've written, nowhere will you find that I say that all Muslims think anything about jihad or anything else, because it would simply not be true to say it. But the fact is that while what you are saying is true and represents a broad tradition within Islam, that jihad is a spiritual struggle, the Khomeinis of the world and the others, as I'm sure you're well aware, are working from the Quran, particularly from passages such as chapter 9, verse 29, which mandates that Muslims must fight against Jews and Christians until they either become Muslim or pay the jizya, the special tax for non-Muslims, and feel themselves subdued. And that is not one isolated verse, as again I'm sure you're aware, but is also the foundation of a broad tradition, theological and legal tradition of Islam that mandates warfare against Jews and Christians primarily. This is not something that's a matter of ancient history, but in 1994, Al-Azhar University in Cairo, which is the most prestigious university in the Islamic world, issued an endorsement of a manual of Islamic law called Umdat as-Salik, which is Reliance of the Traveler in English, and said that it was a reliable compendium for Sunni orthodoxy, which actually carries this statement quite boldly. Muslims must wage war against Jews and Christians until they become Muslim or pay the non-Muslim poll tax. Now, I would never say that this is something that is held by all Muslims, but it does represent the ideology of the global jihadist network, which in Africa, in Europe, and in Asia, as well as in the United States, is waging war against non-Muslims on the basis of this theology. And so I applaud you, sir, in not accepting this theology, but I think that it would be just as misleading and erroneous to say that all Muslims believe as you do as it would to say that all Muslims believe in violent jihad.
Milwaukee, Oregon. Got that right?
Right.
Go ahead.
Well, I think there needed to be a debate in this country that never took place before the war. Well, the Muslims had a bone to pick with us, and 3 bones, actually. It was like our bias towards Palestine and
towards
our
Israel.
sanctions in Iraq that basically killed millions of children and citizens, and the general Western influence in their culture.
Yes.
So it didn't come out of the blue.
No, it didn't. Absolutely not. But also, I think that we have to recognize that Israel, that Western influence in American culture, and that any of the other things that you can adduce, while they all have an influence in bringing the problem to a head today, they are not the cause of the problem either. that radical Muslim organizations can be traced, as I explain in Onward Muslim Soldiers, to the 1920s in the modern world, to the foundation of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which declared that no government had any right to exist unless it obeyed Islamic law in its fullness. That went for Muslim governments as well as non-Muslim governments. And that has been the foundation of what has become a worldwide network of groups that can all trace themselves back in various ways, including Al-Qaeda and Hamas, as I show in the book, to the Muslim Brotherhood. And they all share this ideology, and this has nothing to do with Israel. It was founded before Israel started.
Take an extra moment, Mr. Spencer, and plug the Iraq situation into this whole conversation.
Certainly. Well, the Iraq situation is once again seen in light of a global conspiracy that we can come back right to the beginning of our conversation here today. And you see that if Saddam is viewed as he is widely, not universally, by any means, and not even necessarily by a majority of the people in the Islamic world, but seen widely in the Islamic world as having been a tool, witting or unwitting, of American imperialist and Zionist interests, that the invasion of Iraq was something that he either allowed or abetted, and that it's all really designed to foster American control and Zionist control over the Islamic world. This is something that is widely believed. And so the president, when he says we're going to establish democracy in the Islamic world, a lot of the Iraqis and other people in the Muslim world don't see that as saying, oh, now we're going to have freedom. They see that as, oh, now we're going to have to become like the Americans and discard Islam. And so they resist it.
What about the 20+ million people inside Iraq, based on the fact that things are changing? There's going to be a new government. There's media growing there. What's going on in their minds?
Well, that's going to make a difference. There's no doubt about it. The fact that these things kind of grow in a hothouse, and when you open the windows and you shine the light in, then it becomes more difficult to sustain. There's no doubt about it. But at the same time, because these things are rooted in religious motivations that I think that people in the West generally tend to have difficulty understanding, because we live in a secular society, even religious people in our secular society have difficulty just grasping how much religion influences the understanding of current events in the Islamic world. But because it does to such an extent, and because Islam from its inception has been a political and social system as well as an individual faith, there will always be elements in Iraq, no matter how good things get there, that consider that any democratic government, any Western installed government, has no legitimacy, and any government has no legitimacy unless it obeys Sharia Islamic law.
Moving on to Gainesville, Florida. Welcome to the program.
Yeah, good morning, Mr. Spencer.
Good morning.
I co-hosted a radio talk show here in the Gainesville area for 2 years. We had a disproportionate amount of people calling with conspiracy theories constantly. The most prevalent being Arab oil is, there's a conspiracy by the Illuminati, and I still don't even understand what the Illuminati is. I don't think a lot of the callers really understood what the Illuminati is.
Yeah, I'd like to become a member, but I can't find where to find a membership form.
On that a little bit for the audience, because I'm not so sure so many people have heard of the Illuminati, and I have it up to here, so thank you very much.
Sure.
Hatfield, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, good morning now, Mr. Spencer.
Good morning.
Listen, I'd like to find out, man, why, are you Jewish?
No, sir.
Okay, what are you? Christian?
I'm a Christian.
Why do you ask?
You're Christian. I ask because I'm trying to find out the way things are going with this Islam and this world that we're in now, man, that all the Muslims are going to kill the United States Americans.
No, I wouldn't say that all the Muslims are going to kill the United States. No, certainly not. Like I was saying to the gentleman earlier, not all Muslims believe in the radical jihad ideology that fuels the global jihad movement. But it is a significant element that we have to recognize. A lot of people would like to think that Osama bin Laden and his ilk are a tiny minority of extremists who have been already discredited in terms of any Islamic understanding of things. And that's not the case. As a matter of fact, right now, they have the ascendancy in the Islamic world in terms of winning the debate about what the Quran means and how it is interpreted. And this is something that we have to understand and address, because simply by ignoring it or wishing it weren't so is not going to make it go away.
The last chapter of your book, Robert Spencer, How to Fight the War We're In. Tell us some of your ideas here.
Well, I think that in the first place, we have to call upon more cooperation from the American Muslim community. There was recently a news item that I saw in researching material for Jihad Watch. As a matter of fact, I came across a news item that said that the FBI was calling upon American Muslims in a particular place, I forget where, to cooperate with efforts to eradicate terrorism from their communities. And I thought, well, this is news. This hasn't been being done since 9/11. There was recently a conference of American Muslim advocacy groups in Chicago where they complained a lot about profiling and about FBI efforts, and they had a lot of conferences and talks about how to resist investigations and how to protest against these kinds of anti-terror efforts. But there was not one word spoken about how to cooperate with anti-terror efforts or how to work to eradicate radical Islam from their communities. And this is what we have to call upon them to do, or simply to allow in terms of the mosques. Let there be people who are going in and observing. This is not something that interferes with anyone's civil rights or freedom of religion. These are public meetings. You have somebody paying attention, because we already have abundant evidence, as I show in the book, and there's been more confirming evidence since the book has come out, that radical Muslims are operating in American mosques to recruit and motivate terrorists. The Lackawanna, New York case was just one of many. And that being the case, we simply have to be paying attention to what is going on there. That's one step.
You also talk about immigration controls. Is the U.S. government doing enough?
No, certainly not. And I'm not talking about anything but simply enforcing the rules that are already on the books and bringing some sanity to background checking. People are opposed to this because they say, well, it will slow down the visa process immeasurably. And I think, well, you're breaking my heart. You're gonna keep people from coming into the country for a couple of weeks, and maybe keep some terrorists from getting here. I think that's worth the trade-off.
Encourage moderate Islam at home and abroad. Yes. What is moderate Islam?
Moderate Islam is, I'm glad you asked that question, because that's something that's widely misunderstood. A lot of people in the United States claim to be moderate Muslims, like the Council on American Islamic Relations, but then there are these questions about their activities that remain unanswered. As a matter of fact, I called Ibrahim Hooper of the Council on American Islamic Relations precisely to ask him these questions, and he hung up on me. So I invite him to get in touch with me, and we can discuss these things. I'd be very happy to hear his side of the story.
He's been on this program, by the way.
Yes. Mm-hmm. But in any case, the fact is that moderate Islam really has to be an Islam that explicitly rejects violent jihad. There are plenty of Muslim spokesmen who say Islam is peaceful and don't even acknowledge the existence of violent jihad. That's a different thing, because there is deception, and deception is not reform. Now, what we need is the way the Pope apologized for the Crusades and repudiated any theology that justified them. We need to see moderate Muslims apologize for the depredations of jihad throughout history and repudiate the theology that led to them, because actually no Muslim sect to this day has renounced the doctrines of jihad warfare. And this is something that has to be done for there to be progress. And we need to find Muslims who are willing to do it. I've spoken to a few individuals here and there, but we need to see them group together. We need to see this movement grow and do everything we can to help it.
Levittown, Pennsylvania, good morning.
Yes. The other day, I have a park in front of my house, and a couple of gentlemen were stuck in the mud, and I ended up helping them. They ended up being from Egypt.
Yes.
And we ended up talking a little bit, and they were very convinced that it's a Jewish-run media, and the Jews run the world, and all that stuff. And I was a little struck back by that.
Caller, did they say where they got their ideas from?
Well, they are from Egypt. You know what I mean? They are really from there. They just probably came from there. And we didn't have too much time to talk, but I was really shocked by it, and especially shocked since the fact that there's 2 billion Christians, and I have no idea how many Jews there are. There are just only so many, but I know there's not billions of Jews.
15 million, maybe? I'm not sure.
Something like that. And I remember that was some of the premise that Hitler used for his power grab, was to say the Jews ran the world, they ran the economy, and all the problems of the Jews. So I wanted to know what you thought about those ideologues.
Well, I think I tend to agree with you. I think that those ideas are widespread. You saw them coming from the Malaysian Prime Minister, Mahathir. He himself said that the Jews run the world at an international Islamic conference, and there wasn't anybody standing up and saying, hey, you're talking nonsense. As a matter of fact, they all applauded him, including Hamid Karzai, our man in Afghanistan. And this is a very widespread belief that's rooted in passages of the Quran, as I said before, that show the Jews conspiring against the Muslims. And it is fueled daily by the distribution of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was even going on in New Jersey a couple years back. There was an Arabic language Muslim newspaper that was running the protocols in serial form. And this is something that does fuel hatred and fuels divisiveness, and it's a kind of paranoia that is very difficult to eradicate, but I think that it must be confronted, or there's just no hope for any kind of accord.
Is there anyone in that part of the world, Mr. Spencer, that you can point to, whether it's a media, a leader, or a government person, who actually does a good job at diffusing this type of tension?
It's very difficult to do it. You know, this is the kind of thing that is going on at the highest levels, because when I said that the protocols were on Syrian television, that of course, you know, this is state-run, this is state-approved material, and it was the same thing in Egypt. And so you're talking about really, if not the highest leaders in those countries, but certainly high officials in those countries who are fueling this kind of thing. And even people who are opposed to it, they have a very difficult time in eradicating it, because of course you're dealing with the distribution of materials that doesn't always go on in official channels.
Castleberry, Florida, for Robert Spencer. Good morning.
Good morning, and thank you for C-SPAN.
Sure.
I just had a couple points that I wanted to make. Much of what you say, Mr. Spencer, is true, but we don't have to look all the way back to the origins in the Quran or even the Crusades. A lot of the their memory is a lot shorter. I think that this. First of all, let me say that what happened on 9/11, there's no question. It's ridiculous to think that the CIA did it, or that there was some sort of a conspiracy. But of that thought, I think comes directly from actual facts in history. The Lavon affair, where the Mossad actually did plant bombs with the help of Egyptian Jewish citizens in Egypt, and were exposed for trying to blame Egyptians for it. I mean, they noticed this. The overthrow of Mossadegh, who was democratically elected in Iran,
Yes.
we were behind that, and they know that.
Oh yes, I'm not saying that, as I said before, I'm not saying none of these things ever go on, whatever may be the particularities of the cases that you mention. But I would like also to address, you were saying that their memories are not that long. Actually, their memories are quite long. The historical memory in the Muslim world is far longer than in the Western world. And they, as a matter of fact, recently in an Al-Qaeda publication that just came out last month, they refer to their war against the Byzantines. Now, as far as any American may know, the Byzantines were some ancient people way back when. The Byzantine Empire actually fell on May 29th, 1453, when it was conquered by the Islamic Jihad armies of the Ottoman Empire. But the Byzantines are named in the Quran as being the opponents of the Muslim, one of the opponents of the Muslims. They are frequently in Islamic tradition in the Hadith as being the opponents of the Muslims. And so the Al-Qaeda, when they want to refer to their enemies, they call them the Byzantines. This is something that they know that their readers in the Islamic world will understand, because they view the contemporary world through the prism of the Quran and Islamic history. This is something that I think we ignore at our own peril.
We go to Seattle now. Good morning.
Good morning. I have a question for both of you. Once, Dr. Spencer, I first heard about you at your littlegreenfootballs.com.
Yes,
and,
excellent site.
Yes, it is. And there's also Memory, Middle East Media Research.
Another excellent site.
The second one just strikes me as something that is entirely objective. They don't put a spin on it or any kind of editorializing. They just translate.
Yes.
And what I'm seeing there is it could make your blood run pretty cold.
Yes.
But luckily, I have seen a few things from some Saudi writers which are pretty supportive of the war on terror and pretty supportive of
yes,
even the Iraqi freedom.
Oh, absolutely.
And before, I know I only have one chance to ask one question, so I'll ask this to the moderator. I'm very curious why the calls are being sequestered by support President Bush or oppose President Bush when you have a guest that's talking about jihad. It doesn't make any sense.
What would you recommend while we have you there?
Well, I just don't see. It seems so non sequitur. It doesn't fall entirely. I mean, if this man's warning us, or just not really even warning, just exposing radicalism and extremism in one part of the world that most Americans don't understand fully, why would you put up something that says oppose President Bush or support President Bush? It doesn't make any sense.
We get the point. Thank you. Robert Spencer, want to speak to the first comment? So there are some in Saudi Arabia who
yes,
are
there
doing
are.
well?
Absolutely. There are voices all over the Islamic world that are significantly positive, and I certainly hope that they win out. At this point, they are not majority voices, and that's not to say that they don't exist, and I applaud their efforts. I support their efforts. I hope that they are able to gain more support, but we have to be forthright about what they're up against.
Last call, New York City. Good morning.
Morning. Before I say what I was going to say quickly, I think that last caller's last point, I had exactly the same reaction when asked if I support or oppose President Bush. It almost implies that opposing President Bush means that you oppose this guest, and which is exactly what I do not. I oppose President Bush, and I'm a liberal and a Democrat who feels nonetheless that on this subject, the vital things that need to be said are said mostly, if not entirely, in places like frontpage.com and by people like Dr. Spencer. Is it Doctor?
Actually, no.
Mr. Spencer.
Yes, thank you.
But my question for you was, can you in any way quantify or estimate how widespread such conspiracy thinking is in the Muslim world? And secondly, if you haven't already answered this, do you think that our war in Iraq is going to have a positive effect on this mentality and an ameliorative effect, or the contrary, or what kind of effect do you think it'll have?
Well, in the first place, there's really no way to tell how widespread it is because it spreads and mutates so quickly that there's no way to quantify it. As far as the war in Iraq goes, it's in the first place, it inspired at the beginning an explosion of this kind of thinking. But if the efforts are successful to establish a stable government there, then we might see some opposing currents come forth. But there was another thing that you had said, actually.
I didn't write it down. Caller, are you still there? I think we
gone.
lost that caller. Why don't you wrap up and look ahead to
Oh,
the
yeah,
coming...
I remember. He had said he was a Democrat. I appreciate that very much because actually I don't see this as a matter of supporting or opposing the president either. I see that anybody who's interested in the universal dignity of mankind and in human rights should be opposing the efforts of violent jihadists everywhere, because the Islamic law that they want to impose institutionalizes oppression of non-Muslim minorities and women in Islamic societies, and this is the Islamic society that they want to establish in the United States and everywhere else that they possibly can, and is a real viable reality in the next few decades in Western Europe. And so I think that this is something that's a universal issue that liberals, conservatives, everyone should be supporting. And so I thank you.
Robert Spencer is columnist for FrontPageMag.com, also director of Jihad Watch and author of this book, Onward, Muslim Soldiers, How Jihad Still Threatens America and the West. Thanks a lot for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Well, coming up in about half an hour, we're going to take a look at the Endangered Species Act, 30 years after it came into being, and a couple of other program notes on this program tomorrow. We start off at 7 o'clock Eastern Time, and our guests include the senior managing editor for the